We want to welcome everybody to this second session in this collaboration between the University of Florida College of Health and Human Performance and the Clemon Consulting Group, a series of conversations around athletes and activism. My name is Michelle Clemon. I'm an attorney and athlete development specialist, and certainly last but not least, an alumna of the College of Health and Human Performance and Department of Sport Management. We are tremendously excited to have this group of scholars with us today to talk about nothing new under the sun, the history of protest in US sports. But before we do that, wanted to go over kind of some background of this series and some of the ground rules, if you will. If we could have the next slide, please.
Good.
So as I mentioned just now, this is a collaboration between the Clemon Consulting Group and the University of Florida. It's a 5-part series, and it's going to be 5 conversations exploring elite athletes' engagement of social justice causes. We will be looking prospectively, as well as in current times, and looking back, which is what the focus of today's conversation is. Next slide, please. So the format for each session is that we're going to go 60 minutes tops, and we will have built in that 20 minutes or so of Q&A. Again, I will be the host and moderator for the sessions 2 through 5. You see there the list of the dates we have set, and also some prospective offerings as to when the 4th and 5th sessions may be sometime throughout the month of October. The next session after today is on Tuesday, September 22nd at 2 o'clock Central, 3 o'clock Eastern. And you can always go to register and find more information at the link contained on this slide. Next slide, please. And want to very quickly do an overview of the sessions we've had the session we've had to date, as well as today's sessions, and then the sessions going forward. The session a couple of weeks ago, the conversation that I had with Dr. Segas, who is the interim chair of the Department of Sport Management, was a revisiting of a conversation that he and I had in October of 2018 around athletes and activism. At the time, I was doing some scholarship and research around a framework for analyzing elite athletes' engagement of social responsibility. Well, in light of the racial reckoning that's occurred in this country, triggered by the death of George Floyd, that landscape, that framework that I was discussing 2 years ago has kind of been turned on its ear. So a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Segas and I revisited that and talked about how the landscape had changed. Next slide, please. So today we're very lucky. We're going to talk about the history and provide some historical context for this moment in which we find ourselves. And I'm going to give our esteemed panel an opportunity to introduce themselves in just a second. But today is going to be about the history and examining how models of protest have evolved over time and what lessons can be gleaned from previous protest efforts. On the session, next slide, the session on September 22nd, this is where we're going to change perspectives really materially and hear from social justice social justice workers and community activists on the ground doing the work, to get their perspective on the impact that athletes have on social justice movements and efforts, and to provide examples of what player engagement in activism looks like and assess the effectiveness of their efforts. Next slide. So we're in a unique opportunity where we'll get to hear directly from a sports organization around their assessment and perspective on the current climate and what they are doing to address it. And so that organization, we are proud to announce, will be the Miami Heat. And that session will be scheduled for some time in the first half of October, hopefully. And to close this series out, we're going to gather another set of scholars to talk about where activism goes from here in light of all that's happened and how it's changed over the last several years. So in that session, we are anticipating will happen, if not in late October, then sometime in November. But what I'm most excited about, next slide, is the opportunity to talk to these scholars we have with us today around nothing new under the sun, athletes in protest in the US. And so next slide, I would like to have them introduce themselves, but who we have with us today are Dr. Maurice Hobson, Dr. Kathryn Morgan, and Dr. Kenyatta Cavil. And I'm going to turn it over to each of them to respectively give their introductions.
Dr. Hobson.
Okay, so good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you all today and to be on this esteemed panel. I am thankful to Dr. Sagas and Attorney Clemon for this opportunity. My day job is that I am a professor of history and African American studies at Georgia State University in Atlanta. But I am also a former college athlete, Division I college football player, played for the University of Alabama at Birmingham Blazers from 1995 to 1998, and graduated from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. My work as a professor is very much steeped in civil and human rights, urban history, political economy, oral history. And on many levels, the kind of research that I've been able to produce has looked at sports, particularly the Olympics, and how cities are franchised for world consumption due to big sporting events such as the Olympics, World Cup, Super Bowl. But who loses in that, you know? And so I've created a theoretical framework called the Olympification of a city that involves several different theoretical frameworks to demonstrate that. And so it's a pleasure to be here today, and I hope something that I say is useful and thoughtful.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kathryn Morgan, and I am Director of the African American Studies Program here at UAB. My area, I primarily publish in areas of social justice as it relates to race, crime, and social policy. And I have been looking at, and I've done several interviews regarding the justice system and some of the things that are going on now as it relates to policing and court decisions and those kinds of things. So I got interested actually in sports. When I was younger, I was an athlete, but not recently. I had to teach this class, the history of sport. We created this class in African American Studies called the History of Sport, the African American Experience. And it was a look at it was a historical look at the African American experience through sports. And I didn't have a teacher one semester, and I had to develop the class myself and teach the class myself. But it gave me an opportunity to really kind of look at some of those past writings, got interested in the work of Harry Edwards, sociologist who deals with sports, and just looking at, and I've watched with interest some things that are going on now as it relates to activism, athletes and activism. And so I am grateful that Michelle asked me to be a part of this panel. I'm humbled. And again, I hope to learn a lot from the scholars here and athletes. And I'm curious, I was here at UAB when Dr. Hobson was here, so I don't know how I missed you. I was here when the football team started. I was here when it was abolished, and I'm back. And so I'm here now that's back. And so sorry I missed you in some of my classes. So that's who I am.
Yes, I am Japhus Kenyatta Cavil, a professor of sport management, sports studies, and sports entertainment at Texas Southern University and the College of Education with a joint appointment in the School of Communication. I must confess that my athletic prowess or career, whatever you want to call it, stopped at the high school level. So I do not have the collegiate experience, unlike my brothers, which I guess I'll trot them out here so I can be amongst these great peers in terms of their collegiate athletic experiences and prowesses of the success that they were able to have. My middle brother, Chael, played at East Central University as he was part of the NAIA national championship football team. And then my brother went on to play football at the University of Texas. He was a freshman wide receiver when Ricky Williams won the Heisman. And set a record for, at that time, a record for receptions in a year. But I bring all that up to talk about, that led me actually on my second career path at the collegiate level in terms of a professorate in research, where my research is at the intersection of leadership, sport, business, HBCU sports studies, a new phenomenon for some people, regarding the critical sports studies, sports culture theory, athletic aesthetics, and Black expression, if you would, which I define as the sporting HBCU diaspora. I have published research articles such as the state of intercollegiate athletics at historically Black colleges and universities, past, present, and persistent. Completed commission studies such as HBCU, a minimum of 9, a maximum of 12 football reclassification for Texas Southern University and the Southwestern Athletic Conference. Looking at what would it take to move HBCUs in terms of the current classification at the FCS to an FBS conference formation. Case study for Tennessee State as expansion member of the SWAC, Economic Impact. Most recently, I co-published an edited textbook titled The Athletic Experience at Historically Black Colleges and Universities, Past, Present, and Persistence. This was a co-edited book, textbook, if you would, with Dr. Billy Hawkins at the University of Houston, Joseph Cooper at the University of Massachusetts, and Dr. Keila Carter-Francique at San Jose State University. Finally, I produced, co-host Dr. Bill's Inside the HBCU Sports Lab with Mike Washington and Charles Bishop, a weekly sports talk radio show that looks at the experiences of HBCU athletes, administrators, and fans around the country, looking at HBCU sports, of course.
Great. Thank you all for being a part of this. You have such impressive backgrounds and resumes. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So we're going to start with the first question, which is, so it seems important before we get into the nuts and bolts of this conversation to really frame some of the key terms that we'll be talking about. And so the first question is, how do you define activism, protest, and player empowerment? Whoever wants to go first, go for it.
When I think about activism, I look at it as being opposition to the status quo that promotes social, economic, and political inequalities, racial discrimination, and other oppressive systems and structures that disproportionately impact marginalized groups. The ultimate goal is social change, and certainly empowering those who are impacted by these oppressive structures. I look at athlete activism as, high-profile athletes using their high-status profiles to affect social change as it relates to social and political and cultural inequalities.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, I see activism, and initially, when we think about it in the American context, we often think about it as being anti-oppression. But we do have to realize that there are white power activists right now who are promoting oppression. And so my definition is that, activism is when one uses their value system and platform or play a field as a battleground to bring about political and social change. And so that can vary in particular circumstances. But when we talk about, protest, what we're talking about is actually running against, as Dr. Morgan said, the status quo. We're working against any kind of a system that does not allow for one to express themselves on their own terms, particularly in terms of their person versus being a part of the mechanism of the sport. And so player empowerment is one to where, players, athletes on the field are able to operate in their own interest, or interest that will allow for them to contribute to their respective teams, but it won't be a detriment to their own person.
certainly in the context of my colleagues, I think they really have broken down activism, protest, and player empowerment. But just would like to add a little more context in terms of what I see it and as I see it in regarding to some of the research I've done. So I've defined each of the above terms in terms of activism as individual, group, and or institutional acts of supporting a position regarding changing political and social policies, much as we've said. Protest in particular as an act of a statement, if you would, or an action of articulating disapproval or concerns of policies that exist, situations, opposing courses of actions, which obviously is different in terms of boycott, which I think needs to be on the table, which is the withdrawal from a commercial and social relationship within the country, looking at it globally, as Brother Hobson talked about, organizationally, institutionally, or as a person. And it's a statement in regards to, if you would, as a punishment or a protest for actions that is heaped upon those individuals as a country, organization, institution, or person. I think it's important that we contextually not just look at this as an individual, and that gets into that player empowerment. I've written and defined not just individual player empowerment, if you allow me to kind of contextualize this, and from a framework in terms of cultural empowerment. Reading in terms of what Hobson has talked about in some of his work, he gets at that point, particularly not just in terms of ethnic groups, but if you look at it particularly from Black cultural empowerment, it characterizes it as an institution and social events that recognize and celebrate the uniqueness of Black history, culture, traditions, and other mores. More specifically, I like to bring up the fact that Black cultural empowerment is reflected in HBCUs in terms of potentially educational curriculum, athletic events would place an emphasis on Black cultural values, norms, and practices. A quick example of that is the example of Black cultural empowerment, if you would, looks at HBCUs, which can include the inclusion of curricula that focuses on the experience of African Americans and Black African Americans through the worldwide and critical mass of Black faculty, administrative staffs and students, the naming of buildings after famous African Americans, HBCU classics, famous Battle of the Bands, competition, Black Greek organizations, step shows, widespread Black centered initiatives, which we simply just oftentimes call the culture.
Mhm.
Well, I'm going to hop off road just for a second. Dr. Cavil, you mentioned the distinguishing boycott from protest. Would you, based on your definition of boycott, would you consider or regard what the 30 NBA teams did 2 weeks ago a boycott?
Mhm.
Not necessarily, because I think for them, it was more of a pause. I think there is some consideration where you could call it a boycott as they were taking a collective action. But as we learn more about that, they were really deciding what direction they would take. So it's not as if they went into it as a said boycott. I think that may have what came out afterwards. But for them, I think it was just an emotional collective pause. When you talk about being in the bubble, and all of us to some extent dealing with COVID-19, you know, having to be comfortable about being uncomfortable. And those that really think about themselves or others, you know, have put themselves in positions where they've done things that they pretty much don't normally do in their day-to-day. And so when you isolate individuals, even if it's in a group context, team, you know, institution, that's different than the norms. And so you start putting these stressors on them, essentially what's going on in society, which they are a framework, which oftentimes we forget just because they have a class status that is different than many of their ethnic group. Ultimately, what seems to come out is we start to see them as othering. We separate them. But that statement in itself was talking about them and of the people when you framework that. And so that's when I think it was more of a collective pause that ultimately became a short boycott in terms of exchanging things they wanted for them to get back to playing basketball.
Any other reactions to that boycott question?
When you talked, I was thinking about the University of Missouri football players. Would you classify that as a boycott, where they said, we will not play, until the president of the university has been terminated, and ultimately got that demand met? So would you classify that as a boycott?
I certainly would, but I'd love to hear Hobson's perspective on that.
So I'm thinking about this, and so as a historian that does labor studies, I saw the event a couple of weeks ago as a wildcat strike, really more of a work stoppage. And so it's a work stoppage to see, where things are, how they're going to organize, and then it can come into a full-fledged strike. I found it interesting that they reached out to President Barack Obama, who's one of the greatest constitutional and legal scholars that there is, because they understood the ramifications of it and how they were going to be able to do things. And what they were doing is they were pushing a constitutional right. But I would see it more or less as a wildcat strike instead of a full-fledged strike, and it's more of a work stoppage piece. Whichever way it was somewhat effective, and they got some action.
And I'm the moderator in this space, but I will observe that as an attorney, I had debates with my other lawyer friends around whether this was a boycott or some form of a strike, a wildcat strike. And I think where we landed was that it was kind of this interesting mix of both. Like it had elements of a boycott, and it had elements of a traditional strike. But it's still weeks later an interesting ball to kick around, so to speak. So having kind of framed some of, this discussion around what these terms mean and reaching some level of consensus around him, the next question that I have is, in your opinion, when or where were the roots of athlete activism formed or grounded in this country? Like where does that begin from your perspective? I have some thoughts on it, but I'm much more curious as to you as historians and sociologists, what your views are. Whomever, like this is a free for all. Whoever wants to.
Harry Edwards. Harry Edwards talks about the 4 waves of athlete activism, and he talks about that first wave being the quest for legitimacy and recognition, that you had athletes, Black athletes, who were challenging, white supremacy. And people like Jack Johnson, which is, I enjoy reading about him because he was such a character. He was boisterous, he was the first African-American to be crowned or given the title of heavyweight champion of the world. And it sparked a lot of backlash, riots, because here was somebody challenging white supremacy in a sport that was dominated by whites. So you saw, that was activism. We don't really see that as being activism, but I do. I see it, they're looking for, trying to gain recognition. Saw it with Paul Robeson, who challenged the idea of, athletes. He was a scholar athlete, and he was, went on to Columbia University of Law, and he challenged the white supremacy and the dominance, scholar athlete. So that's where I see the beginning. When I think about the roots, that's where I see it.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. Dr. Cavil?
Yes, I'm certainly in agreement. When you look at Dr. Edwards that he put out there in terms of these different waves, you have the early waves associated with Jack Johnson, Jackie Robinson, if you would, where they were just looking at individuals getting into desegregation, as I would like to say,
right,
of sporting events, Jesse Owens,
Right.
and then you start transitioning into another concept. You know, when you start looking at this typology of sports activism, if you would, one of the components that my colleagues talked about that I like to add is from a team and institutional perspective. When we start looking at the acts of actually not just individuals that sought to provide activism in terms of participation, and at the time, what would have been the norms of society, moving, as I would refer, from Black spaces into white spaces. Oftentimes, we look at that lens from just an individualistic perspective,
Right.
where we talk about these individuals that were successful, certainly at that time, in terms of desegregating these institutions and spaces. I also like to think about it in terms of specifically, we're talking about team activism,
Right.
or institutional activism. When you look at HBCUs in particular, you know, historically Black colleges and universities, as they were looking at desegregating these institutions, these white spaces, if you would, in terms of the NAIA first, as we know, and then later the NCAA, where you had coaches and institutions fighting for these Black institutions, if you would, looking at desegregating these white institutions, these white landscapes, right? And so you literally had, for example, the NAIA creating a tournament. In that tournament, a lot of times we talk about the desegregation of that tournament with individual, looking at integrating their team, right? Desegregating their team with a Black player or two, an African-American player. It wasn't until later that institutions were able to participate that. And when I say institution, I'm talking about these historically Black colleges. As history would have it, you had what you call District 29, where all the HBCUs had to actually play in one district, and the winner of that district would actually get a seat at the table in participating in the NEIA. And so those are some frameworks that I'd also like to put on the table when we talk about these ways in this history of activism, that we're not only talking about individuals having institutional activism, but even these institutions, whether we talk about NAACP, the National Urban League, and HBCUs as institutions desegregating these spaces.
Add something to it, because I think that's important. Being here in Birmingham, the Negro Leagues were very popular, very successful, the Birmingham Black Barons. And so again, you know, the recognition and legitimacy of these teams, of these Negro Leagues, I think you're absolutely right. Certainly served as a root of activism. Absolutely. And so, you know, very successful here in Birmingham. And I found out, you know, in doing some study, that they had some very successful industrial leagues here as well. So it's not just individuals, but you're right, team sports.
Thank you. Dr. Hobson?
If I could throw a long ball, though, I think that I want to bring in W.E.B. Du Bois. So, and Du Bois is a very complicated character. He lived 95 years, and he'd seen the United States change more in those 95 years than we've probably seen since his transition in 1963. But I think of two things. I mean, Du Bois wrote an essay. I wanted to say it was called The Negro in Sports, but it has something to do with the discipline of work and play. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is discussed here is, you know, on one level, athletes are competitive by nature. Most of them are competitive by nature, and they want to express themselves as being, you know, adept and you know, very well skilled in terms of their sport. But then on the other side of it, these athletes represent something that's much bigger than them. They represent the communities in which they come from. And so you think about it in that regard. Black athletes, in terms of race, athletes, or whether it be white ethnics, Irish, Italians, Greek, German immigrants that came to this country, many of them were trying to seek some kind of acceptance into, you know, the American mainstream. But the interesting thing about Black athletes is that by and large, historically, many of them were brought here in terms of chattel slavery, and their value to the white world was what they could produce.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and with that level, we've always seen resistance. I teach my students this all the time. Wherever you see the most oppression, you see the most resistance. And so what I'm saying is that on one level, you know, these athletes are wanting to assert themselves as being, you know, dominant in their sports. And they also want the rest of the community to recognize them. But then on another level, they are more than just the athlete. And so it brings me back to W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. And so as a result of this, I mean, the spirit of activism, the spirit of protest is a longstanding tradition within the Black experience that has been here since the first Africans set foot in North America in 1526, not 1619.
Thank you for your various perspectives on that. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to hop around a little bit and try to probably align some of these questions with where I feel the topic's heading. So we're going to hop to question number 5. What role have HBCUs played in fostering activism in sports?
Brother Cavil.
Right.
As you said, you were tossing that long ball, and that certainly was it. Let me first just contextually talk about, when I look at HBCUs, I think the creation of HBCUs in a lot of ways is, as I talked about earlier, institutional activism. These were institutions that were created from an othering platform, when certain institutions, what I refer to as historically white colleges, universities, would not accept Black people, African-American, at the term Negro, colored people, right? So these institutions were a barrier and opportunity to create changes in the country that we know as today. So when you get into particular from a sporting lens, we talked about the desegregation of the NCAA and desegregation of the NAIA, but just as much as we talked about individual components, you have Howard University early in their history where the football team boycotted specifically, which showed components of activism when they did not feel that they were getting taken care of because they were not getting their meals before and after games. So they actually took up boycotting. So you see specific instances that are more familiar to the mainstream in regards to HBCUs showing activism. And you moving up to this modern term. Many people may have just recently remembered with Grambling State that actually did not get on a bus to go play their rival in Jackson State in Mississippi, which was significant from HBCUs and actually hit mainstream, as like some people like to call it, in regards to that a football team was literally boycotting, not playing, and they were talking about their conditions on campus and their facilities and having to take long trips on the bus. They most recently took a trip up to Missouri to play in a classic up there. Oddly enough, that was during the same time frame when you were looking at what was spoke about earlier with the Missouri players certainly taking a stance. So that just gives you some context. You have outside of just the sporting diaspora that we talk about in HBCUs, you have cheerleaders. You had this context with on HBCU campuses where the Black national anthem was coming back more than ever. It still was played oftentimes at HBCUs, but you saw a more concerted effort with students and the band members and players wanting to play this, looking for that cultural connection that many of them go to HBCUs in the first place for. So that is just an encapsulating framework to look at HBCU activism, if you would, both as institutions, teams, and individuals within those institutions and teams, looking at what that space looks like with HBCUs participating in this Black cultural empowerment, if you would, of activism, boycotting, strikes, and of the nature.
Question for Dr. Cavil. There was a period of time, I know you're the moderator, but I have been trying to find some information about this. During a period of time, there was a drain of outstanding Black athletes from HBCUs, and they were recruited into PWIs to play on teams as they were integrating, those teams. And I can't find anywhere where there was what kind of response from because it affected them financially. What kind of response? Was there any kind of activist response, to this behavior, to this move?
Each institution acted in their own way, if you would, in regards to how they would fight that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to take up too much of the context of this time, but I did want to give a framework of what that looks like. And that's where we get in trouble when we look at HBCUs. Oftentimes we look at the total totality of that group versus the individualistic of HBCUs. Mm-hmm. And so you all from Alabama, participate in Alabama, the framework of HBCUs and that historical arc is different than what you've seen in the state of Texas. Mm-hmm. And I will quickly talk about this contextually from what we see. As we know, when we start going around, desegregating of these white spaces basically started in the East Coast when we talk about some of those individuals then moved to the Midwest and the West, and then ultimately to the Southwest, and last was the Deep South, the South region, right? In terms of those Power Five conferences, if you would, that we see now. Big East, ACC that has moved up to the Big East area, Big 10, Pac-12, at one time the Southwestern Conference, now the Big 12, if you allow me to use that, and then the SEC. And in saying that, the state of Texas was one of the southern states, outside of Oklahoma that first desegregated. And then it went to the Deep South. So it impacted HBCUs differently, as many of these coaches were seeking to have their players have different avenues for participating. I don't think they recognized how much of a flight would take place. We see this in the urban spread. And so in many ways, historically, what I've seen is that they were kind of caught off guard of the mass exodus, but it was over a period of time. So you see, starting in Texas at the 70s, you really don't start to see that out of Mississippi and Louisiana, to some degree Alabama, until the late 80s and 90s, where you start seeing more proliferation of players participating in HBCUs. So to kind of sum that all up, it is really important to look at it in terms of either state or institutionally, which is even different from public and private institutions, of these ways of activism and the alternative of how they affected HBCU institutions and their sporting programs.
Thank you.
I'd like to add to that. So I want to say this. Before I taught at Georgia State University, I taught at the University of Mississippi. I don't call it Ole Miss, I call it the University of Mississippi for various reasons. But they won a national championship supposedly in 1962, and they weren't even the best team in the state of Mississippi. Jackson State. My parents went to Jackson State. I grew up on campus at Jackson State, saw the sonic boom of the South, knew W.C. Gordon, all the coaches and whatnot. That's one of my family schools. But to put this in perspective, and I'm not, hyping up anybody's stuff, there are two really good books that have debuted recently. One is written by my good friend Jelani Favors, who wrote the book A Shelter in the Time of Storm, How Black Colleges Fostered Generations of Leadership and Activism. So this bleeds all the way into the athletes. And then my good friend Derek White, who wrote the book Blood, Sweat, and Tears, that talks about Jake Gaither, Florida A&M, and the history of Black college football. But in talking about that, I also would push you to look at my own book, The Legend of the Black Mecca, because I actually take on the Black brain drain. I take it on. It's a part of what we call the Black New South. And what we see is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which comes out of Birmingham, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that comes out of my hometown of Selma, and how that politically changes the American South. But it also sends this idea that the white man's ice is colder, meaning that his school is better and whatnot. And what that does is that drains HBCU populations. But then what happens is it even drains the faculty, the really good faculty at HBCUs, But then what happens is faculty realize that they're only teaching in theory and they strive to get back south. And so I talk about the return migration, the Black New South. But in terms of this, I want to put this to you like this. My first teaching job was at Tuskegee University. Of all the students that I've ever been able to teach, I've had to been able to have more impact, and I was 25 years old teaching college. And the reason is that I was able to engage them differently because they knew and understood. The ball players knew, the Tigerettes, the Piperettes who were in the band, the members of the band, they knew and understood that, yeah, you're here matriculating. But our job as faculty was to make sure or to ensure that they were full functioning human beings.
Right.
And so the thing about it is, at these major institutions across the American South in the Southeastern Conference or the ACC or in the, Pac-10, the Big 12, Big 8 when it was, or the Big 10, they're interested in wins and losses.
Mm-hmm.
These football coaches are interested, NFL and NBA, they're interested in wins and losses. But I've had the opportunity to interview Jay Gaith's players or W.C. Gordon's players or Houston Markham's players at Alabama State, and or Clarence Big House Gaines' basketball players. And all of them said is, Coach wanted me to be a good football player, but Coach wanted me to be a better man.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we begin to talk about our HBCUs and how they can play a role in this, is that our HBCUs are committed and have always been committed to educating the best and brightest of our race and to push them forward to be leaders outside of their accolades as athletes.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I think I'm just going to float one more question out there before opening it up to the chat and for our attendees to pose any questions they have in the chat. We're going to go to what is now question number 6. Next slide. So for today's student athletes contemplating social activism, social justice activism, what lessons can they draw upon from the history? What is there out there that's a blueprint for them that can be their North Star?
I think the first thing when you look at student athletes, or what I refer to as college athletes, as Hobson talked about, you have these books, and I happen to have that Blood, Sweat, and Tears in the other book as well, and just ordered his book, and it's coming in the mail. I can't wait to get a hold of it because I've read the index part of it, and it's going to get me into some areas and close some gaps that I was looking at, particularly in the research. And so I can't wait to get my hands on it. But to stack some more of that information that he's talking about, you're talking about people that literally have spent their careers of digging into this research and exploring in so many different ways. So I think one of the things college athletes need to be careful about is understanding the history.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes time.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes I can understand in this current environment that they don't want to take that kind of time. So I would recommend that they align themselves with individuals that have done that work. Not to speak for the other two on this venue, but I'm sure that with regards to everything that they have going on, that they would love the opportunity to provide the tutelage for those that would be interested in partner and putting them in a space and a position so they can move forward. So I really think it's important for them to understand that their concerns and pains and hurts and happiness are natural feelings they should have. But in this space, they really need to understand contextually what it means to be what some people would talk about a social activist. And part of that is going to be about grooming themselves in a position so they understand the nature of this fight and all the information as much as possible they can in terms of how they guard themselves against individuals that certainly may do them harm. So my part in this would talk about understanding the need to partner, to really think through this process and all the information that they can in terms of how they can collectively move together to help create this change that they want to see.
I think you're absolutely right, understanding the history, but also understanding that they have a voice.
That's right.
And now they can use that voice. I remember maybe 2 or 3 years ago, some of the athletes at UA spoke out about something that was going on, some racial inequality. And so they were told that all you need to do is run that football on Saturday and you let the white man take care of the social issues and the politics. And, you know, now 3 years later, last Monday, they had a social justice walk, you know, on UA's campus led by Nick Saban and one of the players. And so, you know, as I looked at those powerful images, I thought about, you know, this was the last school in the SEC to actually integrate the team. And so here we are here. You know, I have to say Saban is a great leader. And I think he makes some attempt, you know, ultimately it's about, you know, the wins and losses. But I think he makes some attempt to, you know, make them aware, make them socially aware, politically aware, and aware that they do have a voice. And I think, you know, that's one of I think that's the awareness is a big thing for them. And understanding too, that despite, you know, the changes that we're experiencing, you know, there will be some cost. There will be some, you know, just as, you know, you look back at Jack Johnson and some of the early players, you look at, can't think of his name, who owned the first Negro League. There are costs associated with that. And so some economic costs, you know, there are costs, social costs, political costs. And so there are costs associated. Anytime you stand up with your voice and speak out, there will be some cost. And so, you know, I frequently, you know, I'm looking at statements from people who saying, I'm done with the NFL, I'm done watching college sports. Like, okay, but there are some costs. Owners now who are standing up saying, you know, we stand with our players. They're losing some stuff. So, you know, they will have to understand that there will be some costs associated with it.
If I can just add this, you know, the title of this panel is Nothing New Under the Sun. And I grew up in Selma, Alabama. I want to just give you a really brief anecdote. And when I was in middle school and high school, the Selma High Saints would go and play the Tuscaloosa Central Falcons. Ran an old offense called the Notre Dame box. And we would practice all week to stop this Notre Dame box because you could never figure out where the ball was going to be hiked and going. About 15 years ago, a new offense jumps out called the Wildcat. And coaches were having a really hard time trying to figure out how they can stop this. But I understood how to stop it because I understood the Notre Dame box. What I'm saying is that there is nothing new under the sun. Mm-hmm. I think about people like Mahmoud Rauf, Chris, known as Chris Jackson at LSU, playing in the NBA and his stance. I mean, I think about Ali. I think about, you know, Althea Gibson. I think about Serena Williams. Serena Williams. I think about all of these folks who carry their whole communities with them. And so if I could make any suggestion, our young people have energy, they are smart, they are bright, and our elders have wisdom. And if we can put those two together, I think that we can yield some serious promises. And Dr. Morgan, I'm a fan of Nick Saban as well, and so I'm with you. I'm with you on the Nick Saban piece.
Awesome, thank you. Have a follow-up, a question related to a point that you were just making, Dr. Hobson. When we talk about activism and athletes, up until recently, you don't hear a lot about the women. So the question number 7 is asking you all to discuss the role that women athletes have historically played in activism. It's an important but woefully underrepresented, understudied segment of history.
I'll say this. I'll just jump out there and say this. I mean, Serena Williams is probably the most dominant athlete in the world. And as a former athlete, someone who is competitive by nature, I can always admire anyone that can put together and execute a game plan. I mean, like, that's a champion within themselves. But I mean, Wilma Rudolph, you know, there are women who have not only been upholding the blood-stained banner of the race, they've also been carrying Black women. I mean, they've been presenting Black women, you know, in a way that has been extremely central to the Black experience. And so, you know, we must do better. When we talk about civil and human rights, I mean, one of the things, there's this conversation that is often had that, you know, Black men don't support Black women. They don't protect Black women. I remember when Maxine Waters got into a squabble with the president. I think Kamala Harris, they come for her in several different kinds of ways. And the truth of the matter is, you know, a lot of others will say, well, that's not true. But truthfully, in terms of civil and human rights, Black men can do a better job. I mean, we got wage disparities. I mean, we have issues around reproductive health. We have issues around, you know, there are all kinds of civil and human rights issues that women face, and men can help them in that. This is not one of those things to where, you know, men have to be, you know, their saviors. It's one of those things to where we recognize that there's an injustice and then we must push forward. And so I think that, you know, women, athletes, women in sports are those that are really playing these sports for the love of it, but showing us in particular ways and how you use your platform. So, I mean, the WNBA didn't get any love in terms of the work stoppage a couple of weeks ago, but the WNBA was a part of that.
Right.
You know, and so we have to look at this with a total lens.
When I was looking at some information, I thought, honestly, you know, talking about women could be a whole panel in and of itself, because women have experienced so many, you know, negatives. Black women, from even Black coaches. They were completely shut out and marginalized in 1968 when they were planning a boycott. They were excluded. And, you know, when women did say something, they were labeled the angry Black woman. And so it's just now with this last wave that you're really starting to see women, you know, given some attention, but still probably not enough. And so if you're looking at, you know, maybe doing another session, another panel, I would look at women because women have been marginalized, and I think they're still being marginalized. You know, when you talk about the activism, you know, it's almost like they're a footnote to what's going on. You talk about the NBA, you know, they refuse to come out and play, but women and the WNBA, it's almost like a footnote. And so they've had so many issues and they've been diminished in so many ways. So need some attention.
I agree.
Now,
I agree totally.
I would add on to that, you cannot separate men and women in terms of the Black context and experience in this country and around the world. If you do that, you are not telling the whole story. And that's what these two scholars are telling you. You cannot separate the two. We've gotten in over the years because that is part of the social structure of this country, is to separate people, genders, ethnic groups, what have you, contextually, to create people fighting over different components. Mm-hmm. But as these historians, these academics will tell you, if you're going to tell the full story, you cannot do it. Quickly, when we talk about activism from the beginning, which is one of the reasons I like to look at it from an institutional team, one of the ways that you start looking at women participating in sports, you go back to Tuskegee right there in Alabama, when you had the women's carnival, if you would, which, as the history would have it, is the athletic director's daughter pushed him in regards to saying, we want participation. So you started seeing participation in women's sports at HBCUs, oftentimes for historical purposes, before you saw it with historically white colleges and universities. And I specifically use historically Black and historically white to provide the equity between those two institutions, and not using other terms that we tend to use in place of that. But historically, when you make that connection, and we talk about the Tennessee State Tiger Bells,
right?
The assistant coach that helped illuminate that program and what we seen at the Olympic level between the great athletes that came out of that, came from Tuskegee in the women carnivals. That was the daughter that pushed the athletic director and the coach Cleveland at Tuskegee to do that. So you cannot separate the two when you start talking about this activism. And that's why I think if we're not careful, it becomes dangerous when we start looking at individuals and the successes that we have had from individuals instead of institutions and teams, and the cultural empowerment that Dr. Morgan, Dr. Hobson really talked about in terms of making sure that we elevate the conversation in regards to what women have done, right, specifically in this space in terms of athlete and activism. I would say that they were at the forefront.
Agreed. We're about to wrap up, but I have one final question for you all. I am hopping all over the timeline here, and I appreciate your patience on it. In your mind, what's the most seminal event or consequential moment, event, incident in this country with regard to athlete protest? What event was it?
I think there were a couple. For me, it was the emergence of the Black Power movement, because it coming off of the civil rights movement, athletes didn't have much to say. You know, they were basically silent. But with the emergence and the beginning of the Black Power era, there was some concern that there was progress made, you know, during the civil rights experience, but Black communities were still powerless. Poverty was still an issue, and very little progress had been made. And so, and during that time, I look at Bill Russell's book, where he talks about, I mean, he's very candid about his treatment, you know, in the NBA. So he talks about progress, but, you know, yeah, we made some progress, but, you know, there are places where I can't go. And so I think I look at that period, the Black Power movement, I look at the revolt of the Black athlete and that attempt to boycott the Olympics. And we can't forget about the, you know, the two, Tommy, we can't forget about what they did and the price that they paid, you know, to stand up for what they believe. They lost their medals. They were kicked out of Olympic Village, and, you know, they got death threats. And so it goes back to the cost. So I look at that period as being kind of ushering in, you know, this modern day, this more contemporary approach to athlete activism, that it really started, you know, at the end of, you know, the civil rights era. And then it kind of kicked up again, you know, the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century.
Dr. Cavil.
Yes, certainly. That was probably one of the most challenging questions that I saw when you provided us some of the context of the pre-questions that we may have during this discussion. And the reason I say that is I want to share is I really think this is a continuum. And so it makes it really challenging for me to look at one specific moment. And that's why when we talk about the past, present, and future, I like to say the past, present, and persistence. Because the struggle is a persistent struggle in regards to historically what we've talked about during this commentary. We've elucidated in a lot of ways of the historical nature of what took place and how it continues to build. And the momentum builds based on those past lessons. And if we ignore that, we can get caught up in terms of trying to position just one moment. But if you forced and twist my hand, I probably would have to agree with my colleague, Dr. Morgan, is when you start looking at the Black Power movement as a turning point where you went more from the individualistic achievements to more of a collective framing of what this may look like over a period of time that you see this. The other thing that I would be remiss if I didn't say, when we get back to Dr. Harriet Ehrwood's talking about the waves that exist, there is a point over time, and I don't want to do this as just a negative component, because I think Michael Jordan did a lot of things in a lot of different ways. But we pinpoint his ascendancy in terms of what he was able to do with the wealth that he was able to accumulate, and ultimately, obviously, becoming the chief architect of the executive of a NBA franchise, is the fact that during that period, there was not a great deal of athlete activism, of individuals, if you would say it. So that means that that torch was not necessarily passed, and the momentum to move things forward was stagnated. Right. So the inverse for me would be something that I would like to look at, is that may be a moment in time where we didn't get to progress as much as we could. And so if I had to look at a significant moment, more so than any other event, that's the moment in time that I'd say that we look at, that period of time where we didn't have as much, if any, activism in terms of individual or collective empowerment to continue to push forward in terms of that collective empowerment that I talk about.
Michael Jordan, and I would say Charles Barkley too. Apolitical.
Dr. Hobson, I'm gonna give you get the last word.
Well, listen, just really quickly, if I can complicate that. See, historians don't see civil rights. They don't see the ending of a civil rights movement and the start of a Black Power movement. It functions in different ways. We call it the long civil rights movement.
Change the focus, yes.
So how we argue is that, the civil rights movement is still going. But I want to say this. When Attorney Clemon sent me the question, I knew the answer to this. And then 2 weeks ago, something took place and I had to change my answer. And so what I'm saying is that in terms of a modern conversation, I think Muhammad Ali's stance is his move from being a conscientious objector to being a Muslim minister, and how he was willing to not only give up the title, but he was on his way to jail. He was risking it all. And the Supreme Court overturns that. I think that sets the stage. In 1967, I think that sets the stage for 1968 Black Power. I think it sets the stage for so many different things. And then I had to kind of pivot, because when the work stoppage took place a couple of weeks ago with the NBA, the WNBA, with Major League Baseball, and the fact that these players went and spoke to an American president, that's a policy issue right there. Like, they're not just out here in emotions, they are systematically and politically breaking it down to the point to where, tell us what we can and cannot do and how we should do it. So I think that the crux is somewhere between 1967 and 2020.
Perfect.
Well,
I agree. Well said.
Thank you for narrowing down, Dr. Hobson. Listen, we want to thank you all for your participation. We want to thank the attendees for coming. We are at time. We do want to encourage everybody to come attend our third session on September 22nd, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Central. You see the link there. That'll give you details about the third session, as well as allow you to register. We cannot thank you all enough, Dr. Hobson, Dr. Morgan, Dr. Cavil, for your time and your thoughts and your energy. Thank you guys, all you attendees, and we will see you in less than 2 weeks. Hope you have a good one until then.
All right. Pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Hobson, let's catch up.
Yes, I will shoot you an email. I'll shoot you an email.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Hi, excuse me. Can I just ask a question if you have a few seconds? Yeah. I was just interested. Oh, my name's Emilio, by the way. I'm a third-year student here at the University of Florida, and I just wanted to ask if you had any names or any events regarding other minorities in the United States, such as Latin Americans, just because of my cultural background. I'm interested in political activism with athletes, with Latin Americans in particular. I know it's very specific, but I wanted to ask you guys if you had something that I could read or look upon.
And Michelle, stop your streaming real quick, can you? And when you're